Pine Hollow Valley, Montana, November 1948. As the widow Miriam Halvorson struggled to drag each nearly 20-foot-long Quonset hut panel up the frozen trail from the decommissioned Fort Carden Army camp back to her small cabin, every man standing in the trading post watched with the same expression. She must have lost her mind. Those corrugated steel sheets, originally used by the military for temporary warehouses, machinery storage, or weather protection for equipment, were never designed for human habitation inside them, let alone to wrap around a wooden cabin like a heavy, bizarre second skin. Yet that was exactly what Miriam was doing. No one understood why a widow would choose to haul scrap metal panels home by herself and then erect them around her already aging house. But she wasn't cladding the cabin with steel on a whim, nor was she trying to turn the home into a discarded army shed. What Miriam was building, though dismissed as madness, was something no one in Pine Hollow had ever seen before. A wooden cabin nestled snugly inside a steel windshield, as if she were constructing a small fortress against the winter. To the people in the valley, it was a joke. To her, it was the survival of her 2 children. And when the winter of 1948-1949 descended with cold fierce enough to freeze livestock standing upright, that steel shell her neighbors mocked would become the fragile line between living and falling. What had the widow seen about heat loss that the valley's best builders had overlooked? If you want to learn about frontier insulation techniques that once saved lives when outdoor temperatures could kill in minutes, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and hit subscribe, because this story proves one thing: the coldest places always produce the smartest solutions. Miriam Halvorson wasn't trying to spark any revolution in construction. She was simply a 39-year-old widow in Pine Hollow Valley who had spent her entire meager widow's pension after her husband's death to hold on to the small piece of land her family was tied to. The log cabin she and Edwin had built during their first summer was sturdy by Montana mountain standards. Thick 12-inch pine logs, flat stone foundation, steeply pitched roof to shed snow cleanly. By regional standards, it was a decent home, even praised by many for its neatness and durability. But that decency couldn't keep people warm at nearly 4,000 feet elevation, where winds from the glacier range tore down like the howl of wild beasts. Her first post-war winter, 1947 to 1948, taught Miriam a brutal truth. A tight log cabin existed only in imagination. Wind found every crack, no matter how small the eye couldn't see. The cold penetrated the logs as if they were thin cardboard. Even burning wood all night, she woke to frost coating the interior walls white. Her 2 children, 13-year-old Ruth and 9-year-old Eli, had to sleep in heavy wool coats, yet their hands still turned purple when the deep night cold set in. Miriam tried stuffing rags into gaps along the baseboards, but every morning those rags were frozen, solid as stone. Their cabin, at best, held around 42 degrees Fahrenheit on rare windless days. It wasn't because the house was poorly built. The problem was physics, the way mountain winds stole heat directly from wooden walls through convection. Every gust slamming the cabin pulled heat out of the wood faster than the stove fire could replace it. And on the night Edwin stepped outside to chop more wood in the middle of a storm, what killed him wasn't the snow, wasn't the distance. It was the wind's savage, heat-sucking power. Standing over her husband's ice-hard body the next day, Miriam understood clearly. If she kept living in a cabin that fought back only by burning more wood, the coming winter could very well take her 2 children from her arms too. In Pine Hollow, where the narrow valley lay trapped between sheer mountain ranges, the winter wind never stopped. It poured down the slopes like an invisible flood, screaming through pine tops, slipping into every crevice, and stripping warmth faster than any fire could replenish. Miriam knew this well. She had lived here long enough to understand that Montana's cold didn't just come from temperature, it came from the wind's brutal theft of heat. And memories of stories Edwin once told during his time near Arctic bases began resurfacing for her throughout the spring of 1948. He had described how the curved steel vaults the military used, despite having zero insulation value, could still hold steady warmth with just a small oil stove simply because the wind was completely blocked and their sealed shape prevented heat from escaping quickly. That idea clung to Miriam for months. It wasn't a finished plan, just a simple but haunting question. What if I could stop the wind before it ever reached the cabin? She carried that question in her heart until October, when Fort Carden began liquidating post-war surplus. Amid the scrap heaps, 20-foot wide, nearly 50-foot-long Quonset frames lay discarded, sold off cheap, and when Miriam saw their curves exactly the kind of steel arch Edwin had described, she knew her chance had arrived. Not a chance to do something eccentric, but to save her 2 children. She bought 1 Quonset shell, disassembled it into manageable panels she could haul herself, and the eyes of everyone at the trading post began following her with doubt. But her plan was utterly simple. Erect the Quonset shell to completely enclose the existing wooden cabin, leaving an 18-20-inch air gap on all sides. The steel vault would block wind before it hit the wooden walls, the weakest point for heat retention. The air gap would become a buffer zone where air couldn't move fast or create convective currents that stole heat. It wasn't engineered design. It was desperate improvisation born from fear of losing more loved ones. By late October, her structure stood firm. The curved steel frames arched over the log cabin like protective ribs, bolted securely to the wooden frame, holding the metal exactly the distance she had calculated from the walls. Miriam cut small ventilation slits to prevent moisture buildup, ran the chimney through both layers with a homemade flashing collar, and built an airlock entry with double doors to stop drafts. From the outside, it looked like a steel shed swallowing a small house inside. Standing in the dark corridor between cabin and shell, even Ruth whispered that it looked truly crazy. Miriam answered softly but firmly, "Let them think that. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm just trying to keep us alive through this winter." The physics behind the house within a shell system Miriam Halvorsen built was actually very simple, though it ran completely counter to every frontier building convention Pine Hollow residents had believed for generations. A traditional log cabin always lost heat through 3 simultaneous paths: conduction, as cold from outside slowly seeped through the wood fibers; convection, as moving air currents constantly carried warmth away from wall surfaces; and radiation, as infrared energy from the living space was pulled straight up into the cold night sky. These 3 mechanisms didn't act separately. They teamed up to drain interior heat in just hours, especially when winter winds poured down the valley. Wood conducts heat slowly, but when wind battered it, heat loss multiplied many times over. Clear night skies made radiative loss even stronger. That's why even the sturdiest log cabin couldn't stay warm, relying solely on a stove fire. What Miriam accidentally achieved was attacking all 3 mechanisms at once with a seemingly insane structure: the fixed air gap between cabin and steel shell. That roughly 18-inch void acted as an extremely effective convection barrier. Air trapped in that narrow corridor couldn't move freely, couldn't form little eddies that pulled heat away. Instead, it became nearly stagnant, stratifying by temperature with height, just like the dead air layer in double-pane windows. Many old builders in the area didn't understand why it worked, but measurements showed moving air at 40 miles per hour strips heat 15-20 times faster than still air. By stopping that motion, Miriam cut convective loss by nearly 90%, a figure no traditional log cabin could match. Next, the Quonset steel shell blocked wind entirely. In Pine Hollow, winter winds regularly hit 50-60 miles per hour, with gusts even higher. That speed created surface pressure strong enough to suck warmth from wooden walls like sandpaper scraping skin. But when wind hit the curved steel surface, it was deflected, sliding up and around, instead of punching straight into the cabin. As airflow passed through small vents and filtered through the buffer air, its speed dropped to just 25 miles per hour, nearly still. The inner wooden walls, once helpless against strong wind, now faced only slow, steady air with no ability to pull heat away. Finally, the steel vault inadvertently addressed some radiative heat loss. At night, warm wood naturally emits infrared energy. In a normal cabin, that energy escapes straight into the cold void and vanishes. But the steel shell acted as a crude shield, blocking some and reflecting a portion back down into the cabin. It wasn't perfect, but it still reduced radiative loss by 10-15%, enough to make the difference between cozy and bone-chilling. All those mechanisms combined turned Miriam's system, though never designed by an engineer, into a giant thermos. No wind touching the wood, stagnant buffer air, reduced radiation escape. And because of that, her cabin could hold 60 degrees Fahrenheit, even when outside hit 35 degrees Fahrenheit, a feat no one in Pine Hollow thought a widow could achieve. Miriam Halvorson's construction process was anything but haphazard. It was carefully calculated step by step, even if outsiders only saw a widow fumbling with scrap steel on the Pine Hollow hillside. She began by erecting 2x4 wooden posts around the cabin, spaced about 6 feet apart to form the skeleton for the entire system, like ribs encircling lungs. Each post was deeply bolted into the bedrock foundation. Foundation Edwin had extended by 30 inches in his last summer alive, as if he had unwittingly left Miriam the perfect extra footprint for her second shell. Once the posts stood firm, Miriam hauled each curved Quonset frame section discarded military corrugated steel up and fastened them with long bolts she twisted until her wrists ached. From a distance, the cabin began to resemble a steel beast crouching protectively over the small wooden house inside. Panels overlapped by 4 inches for a seamless cover. Then, sealed with tar paper, she cut herself and boiled pitch in a chipped pot. She stood beside the tar pot, heat blasting her face, eyes stinging while the pitch smell clung to her hair for a week. But every line of pitch, every wind-tight seam was life or death. It wasn't just windproofing. Ventilation was also critical. Miriam cut 4 4-inch diameter vent holes near the base, plus 2 exhaust slits at the vault's peak. She fabricated screens from scrap wire, added recycled wood baffles so airflow couldn't form swirling currents. She wanted slow exchange, 8 to 12 hours per cycle, enough to prevent condensation, but never strong enough to disrupt the dead air layer she was nurturing like an invisible blanket. The chimney was the trickiest part. It had to pass through both wood and steel layers without letting heat warp the shell or create deadly gaps. Miriam made 2 flashing collars, one from Quonset roofing steel, one from wire cinched around the wooden chimney, then packed the space between with salvaged rock wool from Army surplus. That was technique she learned from Edwin's stories of northern posts, where every gap could kill if wind got in. Those solutions didn't come from books. They came from experience, observation, and the recklessness of someone with no other choice. The entire project cost under $100. $60 for the Quonset shell from Fort Carden, $25 for sawn lumber, $8 for tar paper, wire, nails, and sundries. Every dollar was weighed carefully. She had only that much, no more. To save, she sawed wood herself, hauled steel herself, wove vent screens from old wire herself. The crude materials the Valley men saw as junk, she turned into an ordered, purposeful structure. The work took 26 days, nearly without rest. She labored from when frost still clung to the ground until the sky turned purple behind the mountains. Ruth often held a lantern so Miriam could keep working in the cold wind, while Eli picked up dropped nails or steadied the ladder. Even with the children helping, Miriam did most alone, her hammer blows echoing solitary across the wide valley, sounding both resolute and choked, like a heart straining to beat. Pine Hollow didn't miss the chance to gossip about the widow's crazy project. They gathered beyond the fence, pointing at the unfinished curved steel frame, shaking their heads as if witnessing an obvious mistake. They didn't see the calculation in every joint. They only saw a woman wrapping her house in extra skin, as if hiding from winter. They called it a sweating box, a steel coffin, a useless coat. Some men even warned her the steel vault would collapse in the first big storm, dragging the cabin down with it. But Miriam didn't reply. She listened to it all, then silently tightened another bolt. Because with every hammer strike, she remembered the night Edwin fell at the door in last year's storm. She remembered how his body cooled faster than she could hold him, and she knew what no one in the valley would admit. Without this shell, the wind would take her 2 children from her arms too. And that belief, ironclad, absolute, unshakable, was what forced her to keep going until the final steel panel was in place. December 1948 arrived in Pine Hollow not with gentle snowflakes, but with sky-tearing wind howls, the kind of wind that narrowed the boundary between theory and reality to a painful edge. That winter, later recorded in Montana weather logs as one of the deepest cold spells of the century, began with an eerie stillness on the morning of the 12th, when the sky turned solid gray and the air hung motionless as if suspended on an invisible thread. From Alberta, a massive high-pressure block locked in place like a nail driven into the sky, then suddenly shoved an Arctic air mass down across the Rockies at unstoppable speed. Temperatures at Pinridge dropped from 11 degrees Fahrenheit to 29 degrees Fahrenheit in a single afternoon, as if nature's giant hand had seized the last scrap of warmth and crushed it mercilessly. By the 14th, the cold hit 33 degrees Fahrenheit. By the 18th, north winds screamed at 60 miles per hour, hurling snow and white whips against the ground, creating wind chill near 62 degrees Fahrenheit cold that caused instant frostbite in minutes of bare skin. The most terrifying part, it didn't budge. For 21 straight days, Pine Hollow saw no positive temperatures. Even daytime, the sun was only a pale smudge behind an ice curtain, and thermometers hovered around 10 degrees Fahrenheit. The whole valley was buried in nature's giant freezer, where every sound seemed sharper, harder, brittler. At the town's small general store, men huddled around the stove, no longer talking, hunting, or grain prices, but only fuel. Every face was taut as a bowstring. The firewood they'd rationed to last until March vanished in 3 weeks. People burned half a cord per week just to keep houses above total freeze. They burned wet pine, burned barn-building lumber, even scavenged old boards, anything that would burn. But fire couldn't beat mountain wind. In dozens of cabins, creosote froze thick in chimneys, blocking draft. Smoke backed up into rooms, choking families who had to open doors in the storm to avoid asphyxiation, but that meant letting 30 degrees Fahrenheit wind blasts straight inside. Many said just cracking a door for seconds let the wind snuff, remaining warmth like blowing out a weak candle. At the Branner Ranch, 6 cows pressed against the barn walls seeking any heat, but next morning all 6 stood frozen stiff, bodies upright like ice statues. In the valley, children slept in heavy coats, wrapped in double wool blankets, yet still cried as cold gnawed into finger joints. That winter was no longer a challenge, it was a real threat. And then, amid that despair, people began noticing the widow, Miriam Halvorson's cabin. The first thing they saw was smoke, or rather, the lack of it. Other cabins belched thick plumes, proof of desperate fighting to stay warm. Miriam's chimney released only a thin, steady, light wisp, as if it were merely early October days. On the morning of December 22, Lars Micklin, the man who often checked on families during deep cold, stood puzzled outside her cabin. He stared and couldn't understand. No ice buildup under the eaves, no thick snow drifted against the base, and strangest of all, the wind around the cabin seemed noticeably weaker. He stood on the hillside, watching snow curl in big rolls from above, but near Miriam's steel vault those rolls dissolved, wind deflected as if striking a smooth dome. The next morning, Eunice, who lived half a mile away, ran breathless to the store. I saw Miriam's 2 kids wearing cotton shirts. Cotton shirts. No coats. The news spread faster than the north wind. By afternoon, Barrett Knox, the valley's sawyer who had once mocked Miriam's project, decided to bring some relief firewood. When Miriam opened the airlock door, Knox looked inside and saw Ruth and Eli sitting doing reading lessons under an oil lamp in thin clothes. He froze. Everything. All right in here, Miriam? He asked, voice mixed with doubt and alarm. Fine, Barrett. If you need wood, take some. The 3 of us are fine. Knox glanced at the small woodpile near the wall and shook his head. That amount. Folks only burn enough for 3 days in this cold spell. Miriam replied calmly. We've burned less than a quarter cord in 2 weeks. Knox exhaled like a man watching an old belief collapse. Other families were burning half a cord every 7 days, yet the widow, Halvorson, alone with 2 children, hadn't used even a quarter. Mind if I come in and see? He asked. Stepping through into the log cabin, another shock hit. Knox felt as if he'd stepped from an ice hell straight into a mild autumn. Warmth washed over his face instantly. Not the stifling heat of overfired cabins, but soft, even warmth like a house guarded by an invisible hand. The wall thermometer read clearly, 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, 35 degrees Fahrenheit. A 96 degrees Fahrenheit difference. A near impossible number. He touched the wall. No chill, no damp, no cold contraction, just mild, clean, stable, cool. Not a single draft. No wind howling through cracks. Inside felt like a world completely separated from the fury outside. Miriam said only one short thing. The steel vault stops the wind. The air gap stops convection. The rest is the logs holding heat. I just did what Edwin used to tell about. That night, for the first time in years, Ruth slept without waking from cold. For the first time, Eli didn't cough dry from night frost. And for the first time, all of Pine Hollow began to understand that the widow's madness was no longer a joke. It was proof. It was a complete reversal of the story by truth, by physics, by survival. In a winter where even fire was choked by wind, only one person, the one they once thought insane, had found a way to turn cold into something controllable. And from that moment, no one in the valley dared laugh anymore. On December 27, after hearing too much whispering spreading throughout Pine Hollow, Howard Lorne, the Elkford County Agricultural Extension agent, famous for his caution and hatred of any form of gossip, decided to go verify the widow Halverson's cabin himself. To him, the tale of Miriam staying warm without burning much wood might be an exaggerated winter legend that folks commonly inflate, but thermometers never lie. Lorne arrived early in the morning, carrying 3 types of thermometers: a dial outdoor model, a long probe tube device for measuring in narrow gaps, and a standard room thermometer. His first step was to measure the ambient outdoor temperature. The needle plunged as if pulled by gravity, settling at 33 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind slamming against the cabin's steel vault produced a dull, resonant thud like an empty drum in a stone church. But as he stood next to that steel shell, Lorne noticed something unusual. The wind didn't crash straight into the cabin but slid up the curved surface of the vault, spreading to both sides like water parting around a large boulder. That was the first sign this design wasn't as simple as the villagers thought. He opened the airlock door and stepped into the narrow 18-inch corridor between the steel and the wooden cabin. Instantly, the roar of wind was severed, leaving only an eerie, almost unnatural silence, one that in Pine Hollow winters could only come from deliberate design, not luck. Lorne inserted the second probe into that space. He waited patiently for 3 minutes, his breath freezing in small patches on his mustache. When the needle steadied, it read +5 degrees Fahrenheit. In the context of outdoor wind chill nearing 60 degrees Fahrenheit, that number almost defied the knowledge he had accumulated over 20 years working with cold region farm structures. Finally, he stepped into the log cabin, the heart of the entire system. Miriam stood by the stove, the 2 children reading books, no gloves, no blankets wrapped around them. That made him pause a beat before setting the thermometer on the table. He didn't trust village stories, but the scene alone was enough to make him realize something was operating exactly as theory predicted, something no one in Pine Hollow had ever applied before. The thermometer displayed clearly 62 degrees Fahrenheit, outside 33 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the cabin, +62 degrees Fahrenheit, a colossal 95 degrees Fahrenheit difference. Lorne stood motionless for a long time, repeating the measurement 3 times, changing positions near the door, against the coldest north wall, close to the stove where it was warmest. Readings ranged from 58 degrees Fahrenheit to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, but never dropped below a safe warm level. The widow Halvorson's cabin was maintaining a temperature that even the best log homes in Montana during milder years rarely achieved without burning wood all day. He opened his notebook and began comparing it to data from 14 cabins in the valley he had collected throughout the winter. The best cabin held 42 degrees Fahrenheit. The worst, the Dawson place, dropped to 32 degrees Fahrenheit despite burning wood all night. The rest hovered between 35 degrees Fahrenheit and 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Miriam's cabin, 62 degrees Fahrenheit, using only about 40% of the wood others consumed. Those numbers weren't just a difference, they were a theoretical anomaly. They showed her cabin wasn't merely warmer, it was operating on an entirely different physical principle than traditional log cabins. Lorne closed his notebook, looked at the Halvorson family of 3, and spoke slowly in the voice of a man who had just witnessed a long-ignored truth. She just solved a problem we've overlooked for 70 years. That statement spread through the valley like an official acknowledgement. From that day, the story no longer belonged to curiosity or trading post chatter. It became evidence. Those who once mocked her now stood silently before the steel shell, placed a hand on its cold surface, and realized that within that mocked curved vault, physics had taken the side of a widow. And Pine Hollow, for the first time in its history, began learning from someone they had once considered lost. Because winter never cares whether you're a man, a woman, a widow, or a lifelong builder. It only cares whether you understand it. And Miriam Halvorsen was the first in the valley to truly understand. By mid-January 1949, when the final deep cold spell finally released its grip on Pine Hollow, no one in the valley could deny the obvious. Miriam Halvorsen's cabin within a shell system was not reckless improvisation, nor temporary luck. It was a complete rethinking of how a mountain home could retain heat under conditions where weather seemed determined to strangle life. In a small gathering on January 18, standing inside Miriam's unbelievably warm cabin, Sawyer Barrett Knox said outright what many others dared not admit. "We've been doing this wrong for over 70 years. That widow saw what every one of us missed. From that moment, the question was no longer whether it worked, but how to apply it to their own cabins. The spread began quietly, almost accidentally. The first copycat didn't even use a Quonset shell. It was old farmer Harlan Pierce, living 3 miles south of Miriam's place. In late January 1949, after the cold nearly cost his family a child to hypothermia, he decided to try the principle rather than the material. Pierce built a second wall using spare 2x4s, creating a 16-inch air buffer surrounding 2 sides of his cabin, then loosely stuffed straw into the frame just enough to keep air from moving. The first night, his wood consumption dropped 40% and indoor temperature rose another 12 degrees Fahrenheit, even though outside stayed below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. By early February, 2 more cabins in the valley adopted their own versions. One family stretched heavy canvas over a wooden frame outside the cabin to create a crude windbreak, while another built an auxiliary lean-to roof along the 2 wind-facing sides, forming a standing wind corridor, similar to Miriam's air buffer. No one created anything perfect or pretty, but all saw clear results. Less smoke, warmer homes, less need to fetch wood. Spring arrived, and the real spread began. In April 1949, as Fort Carden continued liquidating remaining Quonset stock, 7 families in Elkford County went to buy them. By midsummer, the number rose to 12, and curved steel vaults began appearing on hillsides around Pine Hollow. No one called them the widow's steel coffins anymore. They were called windshells. The county extension office, once skeptical, now quietly began recommending Miriam's method to households in high-wind locations. By the winter of 1949, just 1 year after the storm, 19 cabins within a 40-50-mile radius had adopted some form of double wall or protective shell. Some used Quonset like hers. Some built cheap wooden walls. Some got more creative and stacked 24-inch thick cordwood into heat-retaining barrier walls around cabins, serving as both insulation and firewood storage. But no matter the variation, all rested on the core principle Miriam had proven with her family's lives. Remove wind from the cabin's surface, maintain a stagnant air zone, and let physics do the rest. The influence extended beyond Pine Hollow. That summer, the Montana Statesman ran a front-page feature titled "The Widow Who Outsmarted the Cold." The article spread across Montana, then into Idaho and Wyoming. Travelers through the mountains stopped at Miriam's cabin just to learn how she cut ventilation slits or built the airlock. She never charged. She only said, "If it saves one more child, that's enough." The greatest impact of that design wasn't how many degrees it raised the temperature or how much wood it saved, but the dignity winter returned to people. They could eat meals without gloves, read books without blankets, and children could play indoors without breath turning to frost. That was the true legacy of the widow Halvorsen. In the many years following that historic winter, Miriam Halvorsen's cabin became a familiar stop for everyone in the valley. She never turned away anyone who wanted to see how the double shell system worked. People came from afar from Idaho or Wyoming, and she opened the airlock, led them through the air corridor, pointed out the tiny ventilation slits, explained why nothing should ever block the air buffer, and why wind had to be stopped at the outermost steel shell rather than the inner wooden cabin. While she spoke, Ruth would pour hot coffee into old enameled mugs, and Eli would run to fetch the small wooden frame model she had once made to illustrate. No one left without learning something. By 1951, the house within a shell principle had spread beyond Pine Hollow and across Elkford County lines. Variations appeared in remote Idaho settlements, the windy high plains of western Wyoming, Even some communities in Alaska, places where Arctic winds struck far harder than in Pine Hollow. Miriam's design never became an official standard replacing log cabins, but in high, windy, often snow-isolated places, it quickly became the most popular choice. Miriam never sought recognition. She didn't write articles, didn't patent anything, and never called what she did an invention. She simply continued living in her warm home, raising her 2 children, sewing, chopping wood like any other frontier woman. But her name stayed tied to the design. People called it the Halvorsen Way, Halvorsen Shell, or sometimes the Pine Hollow Quonset trick. The winter of 1948, 1949 had tested her theory under conditions harsh enough to crack chimneys, kill livestock, and drive even the strongest in the region to despair. The mockery lasted 3 months. The validation lasted a lifetime, and the legacy stretched across generations. The oldest builders who once laughed at the crazy steel vault lived long enough to see their grandchildren build log cabins inside steel shells, double walls, or wind-blocking systems based on the exact principle Miriam had patiently explained during spring afternoons. Even into the 1,960 seconds, the Quonset shell around her cabin still stood strong, barely warped, barely rusted, and still deflecting wind as on the first day. The wooden house inside, protected for decades, remained dry, solid, and heat-retaining just as it had during the winter. It saved the 3 of them from 37 degrees Fahrenheit cold. 75 years later, when tourists visit Pine Hollow, local guides still point to the steel vault and say, "That's where a widow understood wind better than every man in this valley." Because Miriam Halvorsen understood something many frontier people had forgotten. The frontier doesn't reward stubbornness or tradition. It only rewards what truly works. And sometimes the most effective thing isn't a thicker wall or a bigger fire. It's a different idea. Ridiculed, but right. If you've ever endured a winter so cold you lived on sheer will, leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and the worst winter you've ever faced. Hit subscribe to get a new history-proven frontier survival technique every week. The smartest solutions often come from the people everyone thought were crazy. Thank you for following the story. Hit subscribe so you don't miss a weekly frontier survival technique. Wishing you a warm day and see you in the next journey.